Hi, I'm Angel, and this is Beyond the Binary Understanding the Spectrum of Sex and Gender. So, basically, what we are going to talk about here is we're going to do some foundations and definitions of sex and gender and pronoun use. And then we're going to talk about how we can apply this information. So, super straightforward. All right, so let's just start with a baseline sex versus gender. Sex is biological and anatomical. So, sex is about your body, sex is about your biology, sex is physiological. Gender is psychological and social. So, if your sex is about your body, gender is about your brain and the way you interact with other people. So, thinking about why is this distinction important, right? So, why are we separating sex from gender? And I'm not going to answer that question. What I'm hoping is that throughout the discussion, we can answer that, and then maybe you can come to your own conclusions about why it's important to make this distinction and how you can make this distinction when you're engaging with other people. All right, so first, let's just talk about understanding gender. Like I said, gender is a social construct. So what that means is that it's shaped by the social expectations. It's shaped by social expectations and by your self-perception. So it's shaped by the messages we get in media, the messages we get from friends, family, and other people. It's also shaped by how we internalize those messages. So from the time that a person is born, they start getting inundated with messaging. I mean, literally, even before we're born, messaging about what our gender is and what that gender means for how we're going to move through our lives. I mean, what is it? Like the gender reveal parties. So we start it when a baby is still in the womb. We start talking about we start deciding for this person, like who they're going to be and what they're going to grow up into. So that's the social construct part of gender. And then also self-perception. So when you're getting this messaging and you're processing these things, what do you feel applies to you? What do you feel doesn't apply to you? How are you internalizing that? And what is your sense of your gender? So a person's sense of who they are. I've heard it explained, and I really like this, like a garden. So the people who love you are sort of planting a garden for you. And that's your parents and teachers and family members and caregivers and, all the people in your life. When you're a child, they plant this garden for you. And when you're a kid, as you're growing up, they're tending this garden for you. And they're sort of trying to teach you how to tend it. And then when you get older and you're an adult, they hand over the keys to the gates and they hand over all the stuff and they say, okay, this garden is yours now. And then you get to decide, do I want to keep growing what's in here? Does this reflect me? Is this good? Or do I want to uproot some of these things and maybe plant something new, right? And so we plant a gender garden for people, and then is that their garden, or will they maybe go with something else? Is something else true? So gender is super fluid, and so is the language we use for it. And what I mean by gender is fluid, I mean that it is not just a box that we check that's like male or female. And it's not just two things. And even when a person has an identity that fits into one of those check boxes, like you're filling out a form and you can clearly say, oh, I'm male or female, that feels right to me. Even within that, our sense of gender has some fluidity. It's not rigid. There's the way that we perform and identify with our gender is flexible and fluid. And the level of flexibility and fluidity can vary really greatly from one person to another. It can vary across our lifetime. It can vary across different communities of people. But gender is not this rigid concept where, sort of that Stepford wife robot, everybody kind of fits into a certain mold. That doesn't really exist. Similarly, language around gender is also really fluid because language is just a tool we use to describe our experiences with other people and to share ourselves with other people. And so if the language of male or female doesn't work for you, right? If that's not quite getting it, you're going to want to look for language that is more accurate. And so language around gender is as fluid as gender identity. Gender neutral and gender inclusive language has been used across cultures. It has been used throughout time. Ancient civilizations had gender inclusive language. There were many that didn't have a binary for language. Shakespeare used singular they. I think the first written, found, like discovered use of a singular they in the English language is like in the 1300s. And that's just one example. So I'm not going to do the history of gender inclusive language here. Like that would derail us. But if you're ever interested, it's a really fun thing to kind of do a little deep dive, get in a rabbit hole on the internet about. And then we want to consider intersectional influences. So the things that influence can be language. I can't words. The things that language can be influenced by. So other identities, like if you're otherwise LGBTQ, race and ethnicity, age, socioeconomic status, religion, ability, also where you are in the world. So the way we use language here in Jacksonville, Florida is going to be different than the way that folks use language in Portland, Oregon, is going to be different than the way that folks use language in Canada, is going to be different than the way they use it in Portugal, whatever. So wherever you are in the world, or even from neighborhood to neighborhood and community to community and across different identities, we all have, it's not like there's a handbook that goes out that says, okay, look, this is how we talk about gender, or this is how we talk about sexuality. It's more like communities use the language that best fits them. And so that's another reason that it can be hard to pinpoint, oh, this is exactly how you should do this. It's more about the cultural awareness of understanding that there is a lot of right ways to talk about these things. So consider cases where you might need to adapt your own language or establish common ground for language use. So if you're going to be presenting to a lot of folks and you don't know your audience very well, maybe establishing, like, when I say this, I mean this, or, I'm using language this way, but I know everybody else doesn't. So just considering that the way that you're using language may not be the way everyone uses it, and being conscious and considerate of times where you might need to account for that or to acknowledge that. Okay, so let's talk about moving beyond the binary. And so we say the binary just means two. And so it means we're moving beyond this idea of male and female. So an example that is really helpful to some folks is you check a box on a form at the doctor's office as male or female. The example we're going to use here is coffee or tea. So if I ask you, which do you like, coffee or tea? Well, if I don't like either of those, or if I like them both, that's going to be a really frustrating choice for me to make, because this doesn't apply to me. Now, if I clearly like coffee and do not like tea, or if I clearly like tea and do not like coffee, easy to check this. But if I'm somewhere in a space where I'm like, oh, I kind of like them both. So, okay, maybe we represent them on a spectrum, or coffee's on one side and tea's on the other. And maybe I could say, oh, well, I'm sort of here on this spectrum where I like coffee a little bit more than tea. But what this sort of implies is that the more I move towards coffee in the spectrum, the less I like tea, and vice versa. And that might not be true. What if I like coffee a whole lot and I like tea a whole lot? Or what if I sort of don't love either one of them, but I could give it a rating? So then maybe here's a better way to talk about it. A spectrum where I don't like coffee at all to I like coffee so much it might as well run in my veins. And similarly for tea, I don't like tea at all, versus tea is an obsession. I love it so much, right? And sort of this infinite spectrum. And so then you could plot. And for me, I would be somewhere off the scale here for coffee and somewhere like here on the tip of the scale for tea. So if we're looking at my own coffee and tea preferences, I love them both, but I don't love them both equally. But I definitely like, if I have a choice, if I have to talk about my preferences, this model works the best. And so that's actually the model we're going to use to talk about gender too. And you'll see it more. And this is coming from, I think I have it just sitting right here. Yeah. Okay. So a lot of this is coming, this way of conceptualizing is coming from this awesome book called A Guide to Gender. And so we're going to talk about this a little bit more. And I love it so much. And I use this a lot. The Social Justice Advocate's Handbook, A Guide to Gender. So this is a really great resource. Okay. Another thing that I wanted to also talk about, and this is not from that book, is what we talked about, even if you sort of have a box where you think you fit, no one is perfectly neatly tucked into any one of these identities. It all sort of is, we all have a little bit of everything somewhere in us, right? A little bit of, when we talk about gender, we talk about social expectations and social roles, we talk about that's what do people in the social circles we run in mean when they say male or female or masculine or feminine. And so back in the 80s, this researcher, Sandra Bem, she created what she called the Bem Sex Role Inventory. And basically it was a way of studying what attributes people ascribe to masculinity, what attributes people ascribe to femininity, and then how people internalize or personally identify with those attributes. So not were you male or female, were you a man or a woman, but just how many masculine, feminine, or neutral traits did you feel like you embodied based on what society collectively decided was masculine, feminine, and neutral. So the first step was to ask a whole bunch of people to rate traits on a scale of masculine, feminine, neutral. And then they took those. And then the next set of studies was how did people internalize those traits? And so this is the sex role inventory. And so all the stuff in this first column here, those were all the neutral traits. And then all the stuff in the middle column, those are all the feminine traits. And all the stuff in this column here are the masculine traits. And if you were actually taking the study, they'd be all mixed up and it wouldn't be all neatly organized like that. But so that's kind of how the traits look. And so it's things like makes decisions easily was a masculine trait. Like I know a lot of women who make decisions easily, but for some reason when they studied this, people ascribe that as being like a masculine thing. So that's when we talk about the social part, the social construction part of gender. That's sort of what we're talking about. Okay, so how does that play out? So let's say we have the spectrum. And in research terms, instead of saying masculine, Sandra Bem and other researchers would say instrumental because they didn't want to like skew people and like, oh, not manly, but so they used instrumental instead of masculine and they used expressive instead of feminine. So let's say that you were very high on expressive traits and very low on instrumental traits. So lots and lots of expressive traits, but not a ton of instrumental traits. So high on expressive, low on instrumental. That would put you in the box of like feminine traits. And again, I know lots of manly men who could be in that spot. I know lots of people all over the gender spectrum who would put themselves in this box somewhere. So then let's say that you are very low on expressive traits, but high in instrumental traits. Oh, I'm sorry. Very high on both. That was our next one. So high expressive, high instrumental. That's androgynous. So high on both. I have lots of both. Let's say that I don't have many of either. That language is called undifferentiated. So maybe I just really identify with a lot of the stuff in that neutral column and a lot of the stuff in the other columns just didn't really apply to me. I might end up in that undifferentiated box. And then finally, masculine. So that's a lot of instrumental traits with fewer expressive traits. And really, like, all of this is just meant to sort of show, like, even here, it's this very multidimensional concept, and folks could end up all over the place on this spectrum, regardless of their actual gender identity. And so what we're starting to do is piece apart my gender identity from maybe my gender expression. And so what the take home from information like this might be is looking at someone or being told a piece about their identity maybe doesn't tell you a lot about them as a person. And there's a lot more to the story. So people are very multidimensional. And then you also think about things like code switching and changing up like the way you behave in different situations. So if I were to think about myself at work and then put myself on this spectrum, I might put myself in a different spot than if I think of myself in like a romantic relationship, or if I think of myself when I'm interacting with my kids, or if I think of myself when I'm interacting with friends. And so we talk about gender, it's really not this like black and white either or thing. There's how I identify, there's how I present and perform my gender, and then there's how other people perceive it. And so it's very multidimensional. So you don't have to fully understand this table, but what I wanted to do was show like how do researchers understand this? Like what's the science behind this concept that gender is not binary? Because there is lots and lots and lots of science behind this, behind what we know about gender, which is that it is robust and dimensional. Okay, so let's talk about something that maybe is a little bit more fun than that research study. I like that stuff, but I know it's not for everybody. Let's talk about some definitions. So we're back to the Guide to Gender book. And what we're looking at here is the gender-bred person. And sometimes you'll see like the gender unicorn, which is also really cool. The gender-bred person this version of it takes some criticism from earlier versions and has like made it more robust. So I actually really like this one, but the gender unicorn is just as cool. I also saw gender elephant that I thought was really neat. So there are lots of visuals that you might be familiar with. This is just one that I really like. All right. So remember our coffee and tea spectrums, and we're going to kind of employ that here and just do some definitions. So let's talk about gender identity. Gender identity is what I know about myself. So I've scored myself on that BEM sex role inventory, or I've, been living my life and I have these ideas about what is socially expected of certain folks and certain genders, and I know where I fit into that. So gender identity is like what's in my brain and in my heart about my gender. So there's this spectrum, and I could be in both places on this spectrum, the spectrum of womanness and manness. And again, it's not just woman and man, right? It's like essences of these concepts. Okay, and so language we might use would be cisgender, transgender, or non-binary around gender identity. And so a cisgender person, that's a person who their gender identity is in alignment with their sex assigned at birth, or their gender assigned at birth. So a baby's born, the baby has a vulva, the doctor says, this baby's a girl. If that baby grows up and still identifies as a girl, that baby is cisgender. Let's say that same baby grows up and identifies as a boy, then that baby's transgender. Let's say that baby grows up and says, I'm sort of all of it, or I'm none of it, or I'm a mix of all of it. That baby might use the language non-binary. Non-binary is like a type of transgender, but not all people who identify as non-binary would describe themselves as transgender. So the languages mean different things, but basically the two big categories are cisgender, your identity aligns with your sex assigned at birth, or transgender, your identity does not align. It's something other than your sex assigned at birth. And when we talk about sex and gender assigned at birth, we're talking about guesses. We're making educated guesses based on what's visible to us, and we're planting that garden. And again, that person might grow up and say, oh, your guess was wrong. Let's talk about that. Or that person might grow up and say, your guess was right. But until we know this little human and this human has a chance to grow up and be in the world, we really don't know for sure. Okay, so gender expression. We talked about like, how do I perform my gender? So femininity, masculinity, and that's where those concepts we've already talked about. So maybe I'm somewhere on this spectrum of highly feminine in my expression and low masculine. And that might not be the same as how I identify, but it is how, what other people see. So if gender identity is something internal, gender expression is about how I express gender and how other people perceive it. Anatomical sex. So we talked about this. So when we say femaleness and maleness, we're using language that is something other people can understand, but biology isn't inherently female or male. And so I'm not like super in love with this, and I know there's a lot of criticism around it, but right now that's the language we have that everyone understands the best. We'll use it. I'll do an example of I'll fill out an example genderbread, and I'll lay all this out, and hopefully it will make more sense. So sex or gender assigned at birth. So you could be male or female or intersex assigned at birth. So we're not seeing a lot of intersex assignments at birth right now. I'm hoping that will change. But what we do see is folks growing up and realizing they are intersex, and then advocating and lobbying for that to be acknowledged, and even cases where folks have had their birth certificates changed. It's very new activism, and it's awesome. And so if you're interested in learning more about what intersex is and intersex awareness, there's a lot of really cool resources. I'd be happy to point them out to you. But essentially, even sex and gender are not binary. Intersex, if we don't have, I don't want to derail this conversation to talk about like the spectrum of sexuality or of biological sex, but it's not even just inherently male and female. And we will touch on it a little bit more in a later slide. Okay, so sexual orientation, that is something different, right? So with my sexual orientation, this is about who I am attracted to, the gender of the people I'm attracted to. So in relation to my gender identity. So maybe I identify as a woman who is attracted only to women and not to men at all. I probably would use language like lesbian to describe my sexual orientation. But you can see, just like everything else, it's very much on a continuum and not on like checking boxes, right? It's not categorical. Romantic orientation. So if sexual orientation is about who I'm sexually aroused by, then romantic orientation is about who do I want to be in romantic relationships with. So there's definitely a difference between who I would feel attracted to want to sleep with versus who I would feel attracted to want to date. And maybe those are the same people and maybe those are different people, but they are different concepts. And for some people, there are very distinct and important differences. So let's do a walkthrough and example. So if you go to the genderbread.org, you can fill one of these out yourself and you can see how it lays out. And I did an example one so we can kind of walk through it. Okay, so genderbread person 1. Let's say that this person was assigned a female at birth. So baby is born, like we said, baby has a vulva. Usually that's how doctors decide, is they look at genitals and they say, oh, this is the genitalia I can see, so let's assign a sex at birth, or what we're really doing is assigning a gender at birth. So vulva means female, that's in the hospital. And then let's say that this person identifies with a little bit more womanness than manness, but a person with this gender identity is very likely non-binary. So they're a little bit of both and not a little bit of both, and kind of somewhere in a space where womanness and manness both describe their identity. Now, their gender expression, they might express extremely femme, but maybe not very masculine. So maybe they have a very masculine haircut, but otherwise wear a lot of feminine clothing. Or maybe they wear a lot of masculine, they always wear masculine shoes, no matter what their clothing looks like, stuff like that. So there are lots of ways, and I don't know why clothing is just what's sticking to me, but there are lots of ways that we can express gender. Clothing is one of the most obvious ones and one of the ones people use the most, but there are ways even beyond that. So this person, let's say that they identify as non-binary, but they have a very feminine expression. And then anatomical sex, maybe their body is still very much like the body that they had when they were born. And so they haven't maybe done any surgery or had any hormones, done any hormone therapy or anything like that. And their body is very much the body that they had. Now, we'll look at another example of when that might look different. This person in our example is very sexually attracted to femme folks, and masculine folks, but is maybe only romantically attracted mostly to feminine folks. So this person is like, yeah, everybody's hot, but I really like to date feminine folks, or I really like to date femmes, or maybe they really like to date women. You'd have to ask them. So let's look at another example of how this might lay out. Okay, so same thing, baby's born, baby has a vulva, doctor says, it's a girl. All right. And let's say this person, their gender identity is very much, they do not associate their identity with very much womanness at all, but a lot of like manness. And so this person very likely identifies as a trans man or transgender man. Their gender expression, maybe their gender expression is very androgynous. So they've got a little bit of both. They like to play with femininity. They like to play with masculinity, maybe at the same time, maybe on different days. Maybe it's about how they're feeling when they wake up in the morning or about the spaces they're going to be in. So maybe their gender expression is very neutral, but their identity is still trans man. Anatomical sex. Maybe this person has still has all the body parts they were born with, but they're taking testosterone. Or maybe this person has decided to have what we call like top surgery and have their breasts removed. So there are lots of ways that we can interact with our anatomy that are beyond the bodies we're born into. And so maybe this person has a little bit of femaleness and a little bit of male, or a lot of femaleness and a lot of maleness. And so that's why they're scoring it this way. Okay, sexually attracted to. This person isn't very sexually attracted to really anybody. Maybe a little bit once in a while, like a super hot dude. But generally, this person might describe themselves as being asexual. Romantically, though, they really do like to date men or masculine folks. Every once in a while, a femme person will like really spark an interest for them. But generally speaking, this person likes to cuddle, likes to date, isn't a big fan, or doesn't really feel that like sexual fire super often. So you can see that there's like a very wide spectrum of how these things could play out. And every single human is going to fill this out a little bit differently. So it isn't just these neat little boxes. So if you ever want to fill out your own, you can totally go to genderbread.org and those forms are there, and it's a totally free PDF to download, and you can get it there. All right, so let's talk about using pronouns. So we're used to hearing gendered pronouns. Sorry, excuse me, I'm thirsty. So what we're used to hearing is he, him, his, or she, her, hers. Gender neutral pronoun would be like they. So a singular. So they talk about one person. Let's talk about a whole bunch of people. Gender neutral neopronouns. So neopronouns, we talked about how language is fluid and language shifts. Certain communities might use language beyond she, he, or they to talk about their pronouns. So you might hear, and these are just a few examples. There are maybe, I think the last list I saw had like 19 or something neopronouns on it, but we talked about all the ways that all the different identities and intersections of things that impact how people use language. So this is just to give you like an idea. So you might say they, fe, z, or a, right? And I'll show you how that would be used in a sentence. But these are grammatically, you're going to use them just like he and she. So it's really just an issue of learning to pronounce them. So where's Erin? Zay went away to use her phone. Are these ears keys? Yes, those belong to M. So just the same exact way you would use gendered pronouns. I put a link here. owl.purdue.edu has a really cool page dedicated to gendered pronouns and to singular they, and they have like pronunciation guides and stuff, and they also talk about how to use it in formal writing, and so this is a really neat resource. Okay. Also, I'm not going to go over all this, but I did include it so that if folks wanted to look at it later, there's a link here too. But basically, this is different conjugations for and examples of use for each of these different types of pronouns. So you'll see he or she, they, a, they, z, and fe here, and then different ways of their use. So I'll just read the ones for they. So they, them, theirs would be the pronouns of reference. When subject of the sentence, they wrote a carefully researched article. I cited them. Their carefully researched article won an award. That research is theirs. They cited themselves. And so you might also see they cited themselves. And I think either would be okay. Again, checking to see like writing guides. But as long as you're respecting that pronoun use, those little small things about conjugation are forgivable. So specifically using singular they, this can be really like a tongue twister for some folks because they're just so used to hearing it as a plural. Rule of thumb, if you're not sure what to do what feels grammatically the most natural, even if it ends up not being perfect or if it means switching things up. So I'll give you some examples. Oh, what did I do? Okay, so the first one would be, Tam just called to say they'll be late to the meeting. Their car broke down on their way here. That's like super straightforward. But what if I'm like, using singular verbiage in one, and then I switch to they. So let's try another one. Jody has presented at multiple conferences. They have been the recipient of several research grants. So you could say they has been or they have been. And either way, I think as long as you're respecting the they part, like that's the part that's going to be the most important. So really like person first language really applies in this concept too. And if you're doing a formal presentation or formal writing, do what feels natural or check for style guides. So if you're like MLA, the APA is just coming out with style guides that use singular they. AP has it, so go to the purdue.edu and that can give you some guidance. All right, so practicing, right? Because just like learning any language that's foreign to us, like we just have to practice it. That's all it is. So everything can feel a little weird in our mouth until we're used to using it. So here are some ways we can practice that. Firstly, getting used to non-binary gender pronouns. So that's research the pronunciation guides, like Google them. You can hear them said to you, but those guides exist, so research them. Practice using non-binary gender pronouns in conversation. So use them with a friend, use them yourself, maybe record yourself using them and then listen back. Practice writing with them. So one of the tricks I tell people is, let's say that you have a client that uses a client or a friend or a colleague that uses gender neutral or non-binary gender pronouns, and you haven't used that language before. Write out a paragraph and use the pronouns you're familiar with. So maybe do a whole paragraph where the pronouns are he, him, his. Then erase all the he, him, his and put in the pronouns they've asked you to use. So they, them, theirs. And then read it back to yourself out loud and quietly as many times as it takes before it starts feeling familiar. Also, reading text that includes non-binary gender pronouns. So expanding the literature you read. Here's another one. Normalize sharing pronouns. So that means adding them to your email signature, putting them on your name tags, putting them on your business card, that kind of thing. So even if you're a cis person, and you think, oh, it's really obvious what pronouns I use, we want to encourage everyone in the whole world to not make assumptions, because what we have just learned from everything up to this point is that just by looking at someone, you can't tell what their pronouns are. You can't tell how they identify. And also, we don't want to say preferred pronouns. Those just are their pronouns. So it's not an issue of preference. It's an issue of addressing them properly, right? And so, whatever your pronouns are, even if you're a cis person, if you start sharing your pronouns publicly and like doing things like adding them to your email signature, whatever, you normalize it for other folks. Another thing you could do is like wear a cute pronoun pin, right? So those are available all over the internet. They're adorable. Also, there's lots of organizations that offer them for free. The Women's Center has pronoun pins, so definitely see if you can break some of those out. Include your pronouns and icebreakers. So when you're going around the room and you're asking everyone to introduce themselves, ask for name, pronoun, favorite ice cream, whatever your icebreaker is. So include pronoun use in that. And when you introduce yourself. So I actually didn't do it this time, which I can't believe I didn't, but I'm Angel. I use they, them pronouns. It's so funny that I didn't even take my own advice there. And be consistent. So what this means is not singling people out. So what you don't want to do is like not ask for anybody's pronouns and then find that one person in the room who looks a little androgynous and make sure you only ask them. Like that's going to out them or call them out or just make someone uncomfortable. So either do it or don't do it, but do it with everybody, especially in groups. Learning other people's pronouns. This is a really big part of practicing pronoun use. So again, we're not making assumptions. So I like to practice by disclosing first, especially in conversation. So when I introduce myself, somebody for the first time, I'll stick my hand out and I'll say, hi, I'm Angel. I use they, them pronouns. And then what that does is it, one, shares my pronouns with people, and two, it invites that person to share their pronouns with me. And if that person is a cis person who is not used to sharing their pronouns, I've now given them an example and like modeled the language I'm asking for, because maybe they don't remember their pronoun like Schoolhouse Rock from 4th grade. And so now instead of saying, what are your pronouns, I'm putting them on the spot. So they're like, I didn't know there'd be a vocabulary quiz. I've just modeled it. And so they might come back and say, oh, I'm Jim, I use he, him, or they might just say, hi, I'm Jim, and then they don't say anything. And, if somebody doesn't offer their pronouns, just use their name or use they, or wait and see how they refer to themselves. But there's lots of reasons. It's not always unawareness that keeps people from offering. Sometimes people don't offer because they don't want to be outed. So there's lots of reasons people don't offer. So if you're not super familiar with them where you can just ask them, hey, what are your pronouns? Then maybe hold back and just use they or use their name until you're sure. Okay, that was actually my next point. Be thoughtful about when and how you ask, especially in like teaching environments or group environments. So the last time I did this talk, I did it for a group of teachers, and that's why that was an example. But anytime you're in a group of people, you want to be aware that this can be an outing type of discussion, and so we want to respect boundaries. So if you're just not sure, stick with they or names. Mistakes are okay if your effort to learn is sincere. So if you're just making the same mistake over and over and over again and then going, oops, but not trying, that's going to be really evident. At the same time, like people, I misgender myself all the time. I am so used to the way other people refer to me and so used to like hearing other people misgender me that I will sometimes misgender myself. And I feel like such a dodo, but it just happens because our brains make shortcuts for us and our brains don't always do a great job of that. And so, like if someone misgenders me, 9 out of 10 times, I'll just quickly say, they'll say, oh, where's Angel? She went to the store. And I'll say, oh, nope, they. And they'll go, oh, where's Angel? So just a quick little correction. It's like when you see your friend's brand new baby and you say, oh, your baby's so cute. What's her name? And your friend goes, oh, it's a boy. And you go, oh, I'm sorry. What's his name? And it's just a quick little correction. That's all that's required. It doesn't need to be if you do make a mistake, it doesn't need to be a big production. You don't need to spend a lot of time apologizing or making yourself or the other person feel awkward. You can even say, oh, thank you for the correction. So that's a really, if you're being sincere, that's really what's important. Okay, so gender neutral greetings. This one comes up a lot. How do I refer to a group of people? What if I don't know? And so some of these are a little tongue in cheek, and this is a really fun, if you guys have extra time and you want to do a good, if you're watching this with a group of people, it's a really cool opportunity to, kind of brainstorm together. I don't know how close I am on time. All right. So just some gender neutral greetings. My favorites are hello, friends and enemies, comrades, and just folks, or I say y'all all the time. Things that are not gender neutral. So, hey, guys is not gender neutral. Girl is not gender neutral. Dude, even if you're from California, not gender neutral. So then how do we talk about sex while being considerate of gender? Now, if you're, especially if you're working in advocacy, this might come up. If you're teaching, this might come up. So if you're a parent and you're talking with your kids, this stuff might come up. So this is important, right? What about anatomy? And I talked about it not being inherently gendered. So this is a quick slide, but I do just want to offer a way to talk about these things in an inclusive way. So ask yourself first, is this language necessary? So body parts are not inherently male or female. Body parts are biological and anatomical. Gender is psychological and social. We've already talked about this. So replace gender terms with anatomically correct language, or from a trauma-informed perspective, consider using the language that person is using for themselves and mirror that, right? So sometimes anatomically correct language can be really jarring for folks in a trauma setting. And so if a person is sharing their narrative and they're using a certain type of language, you can, kind of match what they're doing. But sometimes you need to be clear, right? So the other thing is too, it can be unclear if people are speaking in code around their genitalia, oh, my cupcake. You might need to be more clear. And so learning anatomically correct names for things and practicing using them with a straight face is trauma-informed care in a situation like this. So we're used to seeing female and male genital anatomy. But remember, these things are not inherently male or female. So instead, just call things what they are, right? So what you're looking at here is a vulva and a penis. So if I learn what the names are for these things, then that gives me a lot of power to replace gendered language when I'm talking about people's bodies, because I don't ever want to make an assumption, right, about what's in someone's pants. And I don't want to make an assumption about their gender based on what's in their pants. So Emily Nagoski says, we're all made of the same parts, just arranged a bit differently. If you want a bigger, longer discussion about this, the book Come As You Are is fantastic. Okay, so don't make assumptions, cover it all with everyone. I'm just going to throw everything up on this slide just so you can see it. But basically, when you're talking to folks, especially again, if you're teaching or doing outreach or in a trauma informed environment, doing any kind of education, we wouldn't want to offer feminine hygiene products. We'd want to offer menstrual products, and we want to offer them to everyone. We wouldn't want to just offer female condoms. We want to offer internal condoms, and we want to offer them to everyone. External condoms aren't male condoms. They're just external condoms. Dental dams, gloves, lube, we'd offer that to everyone. PrEP, PEP, STI vaccines, we would want to offer that to everyone, that when the situation is medically appropriate. So what we don't want to do is just make an assumption based on the way a person looks to what their needs will be and then miss what's important. We want to cover it all with everyone until we know better, until we have more specific information about them. Looking for opportunities to be inclusive. So don't assume that you know what a person's support needs will be based on their name or their gender presentation. So a person named Angel with very feminine gender presentation doesn't necessarily have all the same support needs that a person who identifies as a woman would have, right? So don't make an assumption. So for you, and this is kind of where I'm going to leave it, what are ways that you can make, as this says, be more inclusive in your workplace or in your everyday life? So what are that's maybe a discussion that I can leave you guys with, whether you're thinking about this on your own or you're in a group and you can discuss this. What are ways that opportunities that you can look for to be more inclusive or to change your language? If you have any questions at all, please reach out to me. I'm happy to chat. I'm happy to book time to go over things if you have other questions or provide other resources. I really do appreciate this opportunity to share with you, and I hope that this has been helpful information.